The primary purpose of this audio course has been to communicate and pass on a vision. The new vision of the mission of Catholic colleges and universities that emerged out of the Second Vatican Council and in the wake of the profound changes that reshaped Catholic higher education beginning in the late 1960s and 70s. In the last two audios, I described this vision in some detail, and I presented its substance as involving four complexes of activities, four missions. First, the mission of being an open and ecumenical and interreligious, yet publicly and unabashedly Catholic community marked by compassion and respect for the dignity of every person. Second, the mission of deliberately tending to and cultivating this kind of community. Third, the distinctive academic mission of advancing the human condition, preserving and continuing the Catholic intellectual tradition, and fostering students' search for meaning and purpose. And finally, the special mission of Catholic university administrators and trustees and other campus leaders organizing and animating and adequately resourcing all of these efforts in dialogue and communion with the local bishop to ensure that they are not only taking place, but are taking place in an improved and strengthened fashion over time. Carrying out these four basic sets of tasks is the mission of Catholic higher education today, and it is in doing that Catholic colleges and universities set themselves apart as Catholic and participate in ways appropriate to modern universities in the Catholic Church's wider mission of communicating and sharing God's love to all people. As I said at the start of this series of lectures, the mission is the work of everyone at the university: faculty, staff, administrators, and trustees. It belongs to everyone, and as we've seen, it's complex and varied enough to give each unique member of the campus community a variety of meaningful ways to contribute to it. Not everyone is asked to serve the mission in the same way, and yet each can contribute according to one's own unique talents and gifts and specific roles. That said, though, all need at least some sense of the breadth of the Catholic University's mission as a whole. Though it indeed has many different facets and dimensions, the mission of Catholic higher education is ultimately a single and unified whole. And the better that whole is understood, the better it is appreciated and supported across the entire institution. One might think of the full mission of a Catholic university, as we've gone over it, as a kind of symphonic reality that requires the cooperation, coordination, and harmonization of each member of the community with the total vision of the mission. And absolutely crucial to this collective effort is the work of university leaders, from the trustees and administration on down. In fact, of the four tasks that make up a Catholic university's mission, none is more important than the task of the university's leaders. Because if the leaders stop leading, then the drift to a more nominal Catholic identity, ending in the complete secularization of the institution, is only bound to continue. And that is one reason why I've subtitled this series of lectures A Short Course for Leaders, even while addressing it to everyone who works at a Catholic institution. Yes, certainly all have a part to play in making the single symphony of the Catholic mission be the music that's heard across the institution, but unless there are the equivalent of inspired conductors and concert masters and section chairs in our institutions, setting the score and assigning roles and coordinating everyone's efforts, what can we say is meaningfully happening in our institutions? And how can we be sure that our talk of mission isn't merely the sound of noisy gongs or clanging cymbals, to quote St. Paul, rather than the morally inspiring, intellectually ennobling, faith-supportive, and world-transformative, symphonic kind of effort it's meant to be? Jesus, we remember, reserved his strongest criticisms for the religious hypocrites of his day, those who said one thing and did another, and thus diminished the integrity of the Jewish tradition. Catholic institutions of all kinds, like individual Christians of all kinds, always need to take that warning to heart and regularly examine the consistency of their deeds with their words. And this is just part of what being committed to carrying on the mission of Jesus entails. Given all that I've described in this series of audios, then, a first criterion for leaders to consider as to whether they are leading their institutions as distinctly Catholic ones is whether or not they possess in some form or fashion the vision of Catholic higher education that I've described in this audio course, and that was worked out as the consensus and the norm by leaders of the institutional church and leaders of global Catholic higher education. So how familiar are our trustees and administrators with this vision? How well can they articulate it? And if the answer is not at all, or very little to either of these questions, then they need to take steps to remedy that situation, seeking assistance if necessary. 30 years ago, with the birth of what I've called the modern mission movement within U.S. Catholic higher education, the importance of mission-specific training for faculty and staff became a standard topic of discussion across Catholic higher education. But that was still a time when meaningful numbers of priests and religious still had a presence in the leadership of Catholic institutions. Those days are now past, and of the greatest importance today is mission education for trustees and administrators, where this is lacking, to enable them to effectively lead in mission, rather than just get by on intuitions or a mostly rudimentary understanding of the Catholic tradition of higher education. The substance and the standards of what's involved in the mission of Catholic higher education today, as we've seen, are likely more complex and manifold than many may be aware of, and they cannot be attained through shortcuts or with minimal attention or investment. That requires a well-developed understanding and a serious commitment. Again, if leaders fail to lead in mission, then the whole game of Catholic higher education is sliding toward extinction. Of course, no one is suggesting that carrying out this work is easy, particularly in today's higher ed landscape, where even major Catholic institutions are feeling the pressures of declining enrollments. It's definitely a time of testing, but alongside the test of financial viability and sustainability is the test of mission integrity, and many institutions will need to develop much greater capacity and flexibility in this area, new backbone and strength, or a whole new skeleton, as I put it in an earlier audio. One of the greatest obstacles to this happening, I believe, is simply lack of awareness and understanding of the 50-year tradition of reflection on Catholic higher education that we've gone over. That is why I put this audio course together. But I have no illusions that this is the only obstacle out there. Competing visions and competing attitudes inimical to some or all of what the mission of Catholic higher ed involves are found in our institutions, and in some cases are deeply entrenched, stemming again from the changes that began in the late 1960s that created the identity crisis I've described. One of these is an unwillingness to identify in any meaningful way with the institutional Catholic Church or with the 2,000-year-old lived faith tradition of Catholicism. Speaking of charity, the inclusion of marginalized groups, justice, and the transformation of the world for the better is acceptable, but identifying and affirming the Church as an essential part of living the faith is often not. Catholic values, yes, but the Church and its deepest theological convictions, no. And naturally, I think everyone understands the major reasons for this outlook, including the sex abuse crisis, the Church's treatment of women, its discrimination against the LGBTQ community, the majority of the Catholic hierarchy's political identification with the Republican Party, including its transformed version under Donald Trump, the legacy of racism, and many other historical and ongoing faults. All of this, depending on one's context, is the deep and dirty bathwater that swirls around talk of the Catholic Church in our institutions. And I don't believe it should ever be dismissed or minimized, particularly on account of how seriously it has wounded members of our own university communities, colleagues whom we affirm for all the gifts and insight and passion they bring to their work in our settings. But from my perspective, these things are hardly ever dismissed or minimized in most Catholic colleges and universities. Rather, they tend to be among the most prominent publicly spoken words that one hears regarding the Church and what it stands for. And that often unintentionally establishes a cultural norm about what counts as acceptable language about the Church in our institutions. Criticism is acceptable, but expressions of care and love for the Church? Well, who knows? And that ambiguity can leave some believers, some church members, feeling a bit like outsiders at a Catholic university. This is a phenomenon that theologian Richard Gallardi has pointed out, that expressions of criticism of the Church are not held in balance with expressions of trust and care and appreciation and belonging, even by those who still identify as Catholic. There's been a loss of equilibrium. We've let justifiable criticism of the real faults of the institutional Church be practically the only thoughts and words we're willing to tolerate spoken within our doors, throwing the proverbial baby out with the bathwater, throwing out the authentic Christian faith as this is illuminated by our greatest exemplars, taught by the magisterium and our greatest theologians, and practiced by countless unnamed faithful Catholics throughout the world, 1 out of 6 people on our planet. Many of our institutions, in other words, to a significant and troubling degree, despite being institutions dedicated to learning and the pursuit of truth, often fail to reflect in a fair and balanced way on the Catholic Church and the lived faith tradition as a whole. They've settled for being right about a set list of very real problems and holding firmly to that justifiably important ground only, while at the same time disowning the larger continent of the Catholic tradition in its fullness, historical complexity, and depth. And this is exactly the kind of distancing of universities from their founding church traditions that sounded the death knell of the historically Protestant American universities. They slowly distanced themselves from their church institutions and their distinct theological traditions, and that set the stage for their complete secularization starting in the 1960s and 70s, barring their gates from that point on from any institution-wide sympathetic embrace of a lived Christian tradition. And what we're talking about here, I believe, is a kind of prejudice, similar to racism or sexism or homophobia. A prejudice against the very act of affirming and belonging to a religious tradition which, given the fallibility of everything human, is always going to mark our institutions with imperfections, failures, and injustices. And that particular prejudice of anti-Catholicism shows up in many of our institutions in an unwillingness to publicly own our institutional belonging to the Catholic Church. We're willing to embrace select aspects of the Catholic faith tradition, but as for identifying with it as a whole, even critically, we tend not to do that. We tend to hold it often at arm's length. Needless to say, this is not part of the vision of Catholic higher education we've been discussing. It's a competing vision that stands in the way of our institutions operating with consistency and authenticity, being the Catholic institutions they claim to be. Another obstacle is the reduction of Catholic identity and mission sometimes to merely the embrace of the founding religious order's values, or to simply supporting students' search for ultimate meaning and purpose. Again, as we've seen, these are essential and important parts of a Catholic university's mission, but they are not the whole, and the integrity is only ensured by embrace of the whole mission, all the varied components we've described. Eliminated sometimes, typically in many of these reductions, again, is a sympathetic embrace of the wider Catholic tradition, warts and all, and of the mission to be, in some way, a community of faith on campus. Yes, one that is ecumenical and interreligious in its sensitivities, inclusive and non-proselytizing, but a named Catholic faith community nonetheless, that worships Jesus Christ, seeks to serve others as he did, gathers together around the celebration of the sacraments and the proclamation of the Word of God, and in research and in teaching studies and advances the Catholic intellectual tradition, all as part of a single global faith community. I am echoing here a number of comments made by theologian Massimo Fagioli in a 2021 article of his entitled Identity Crisis, We Can't Lose the Catholic University, and he put quotes around the word Catholic to emphasize it. As he points out, the election of Pope Francis 10 years ago has not necessarily challenged the prejudice against the institutional church or the wider Catholic tradition that is at work in many of our Catholic universities. Though many in our institutions have applauded Pope Francis's efforts to disentangle Catholicism from the culture wars, foster inclusion of LGBT people in the church and in society, advance the environmental cause, and critique neoliberal capitalism, this has not necessarily led many to a change in attitudes with respect to moving any closer to embracing the church or the wider faith tradition as a whole, or to support their own institutions' moves to strengthen Catholic identity along the varied lines we've described in this course. Instead, many still maintain that the only acceptable kind of Catholic higher education is one that mirrors the mainstream liberal progressive tradition of higher education. Catholic universities, in their view, are best seen as unrelated to the wider Catholic Church in any meaningful way, and best not about providing belonging to Catholic students, faculty, administrators, or staff, or other members of Christian communities seeking to faithfully follow Jesus in mission. So what we're talking about is a fundamental contradiction that removes the heart of what it means to be an authentically Catholic institution. For connection to the always imperfect church is, and always will be, a fundamental mark of Christian identity. Catholicism is an inherently communal identity, and yet no human community stands untarnished. To return to the baby in the bathwater image, we need to reclaim the baby, even while acknowledging the bathwater. Even better, we need to foster an attitude that promotes adoption and foster care of that baby, even among those in our institutions who aren't Catholic or Christian or religious or affirmative of any long-standing tradition of wisdom and practice and belonging, faith-related or not. Can we do that? Can we ask for that kind of openness and hospitality toward the institution's religious identity so that all faculty, staff, administrators, trustees, and students can join together in the work of raising up that child, which is the work of carrying out the institution's fully Catholic mission? Can we ask our employees to love that child, even though it may not be their own? We ask our faculty to love their students in all their potential and imperfection. Can't we do the same about our institution's religious identity? That, it seems to me, is one of the central and ongoing challenges facing many U.S. Catholic higher ed institutions today. And though it only adds to the complexity of the task I've described so far, it seems there's no other way forward that truly retains Catholic identity. Now, perhaps my criticism here is too strong. Maybe instead of an anti-Catholic or anti-church prejudice in our institutions, there's something more like ordinary discomfort with what's different, or fear of the unknown, or the difficulty of talking about what's complex and unfamiliar. And there's nothing like an ancient faith or a global religious institution to do that. And I say this because I certainly have the greatest respect for my colleagues at Clark University and know them to be unfailingly thoughtful and considerate. And so maybe the challenge is even more basic and structural, and is simply the difficulty of carving out time and space with colleagues for meaningful conversations and learning about the Catholic tradition of higher education and about Catholicism more broadly. That is something that we at Clark University always seem to have a shortage of, and I doubt the situation is much different at other institutions. From our board members on down, we're just so busy and overtaxed. And that assessment certainly fits better with the enormous goodwill I've witnessed on my campus with respect to meeting the challenges of Catholic identity. And I suspect that's the case in many other places as well. I think we're all trying to do our best with what we've got. And in my experience, non-Catholic and non-religious members of our communities often want to support the institution's religious identity. And they understand that the university is not asking them to convert or change their views, but it's often difficult to grab hold of the new professional identity that working at a Catholic university involves. Which brings us back to the issue of formation and professional development on the level of faculty and staff, and to the crucial mission of leadership, that fourth part of a Catholic university's mission, and whether it is being adequately pursued. When all is said and done, every Catholic college and university still has to ask whether it is living up to the vision of Catholic higher education we've gone over in this course. And that takes time and effort and careful critical thought. Once again, the onus falls primarily on leadership, on administrators and trustees, to face the tasks that being institutionally Catholic hands them, and which there is no getting around. Our leaders truly need to lead in mission, to fulfill the sacred trust that has been given to them by the Church. And if they don't, or don't for a time, then others in our institutions need to help them care for that neglected child, to nurture it and care for it and give it a true home. And this is the other reason why I've entitled these lectures A Short Course for Leaders, because anyone in our institutions can fulfill that leadership role. Faculty, staff, students, alumni, church and non-church partners, donors, and those working on the peripheries of our administrations and boards. History, including church history, we know, often shows that leadership comes from below or from the side rather than just from the top. And if that describes the position we're in, we're certainly able to exercise leadership of a kind in and for our institutions. And all it really takes to start, I believe, is a basic knowledge of the vision and a willingness to share it in small degrees with others. And if we do that, we'll be doing our part to plant the new seeds that continually need to be sown in order to carry on the tradition that we've received. The creation of this audio course at Clark University was made possible through the generous financial assistance of the SC Ministry Foundation of the Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati. Credit and thanks also go to Tom Chesney and David DiMatteo for help conceiving and launching this project, Danny Zanger for assistance with sound and recording, and to Steve Bevins and Roger Schrader of the Society of the Divine Word, Julia Winger and Jean Lang of the Sisters of the Presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and Jim Wallace and Jerry Knapp of the Baltimore Province of the Redemptorists, all for hosting me at different points on study trips and for recording sessions. To each of these individuals and institutions, we at Clark University express our deepest appreciation. In addition, let me express my personal thanks to 3 individuals who have provided me with invaluable guidance in my own ongoing study of the mission of Catholic higher education. Sister Paulette Skiba, Chair of the Philosophy and Religious Studies Department at Clark University, Michael James, Director of the Institute for Administrators in Catholic Higher Education at Boston College, and Father Dennis Holtschneider, President of the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities. Finally, to all those working for Catholic colleges and universities today who have listened to these audios, thank you for your attention, and please don't hesitate to reach out to me, William Gregory, at Clark University, to share your wisdom and experience on how all of us together may better carry the flame of the Christian faith and the Catholic intellectual tradition in our settings. To adapt the words of Mary Frances Clark, I believe we can leave the future to God and have no fear as long as we are working together unitedly. To all of us working across Catholic higher education, may we continue to support each other and shine the light of the gospel to the greater glory of God.